Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Merle Massey, and I'm the coordinator for undergraduate research at the University of Saskatchewan. And today, for the Student Undergraduate Research Experience program, we have with us Kevin Reed, who is an associate librarian with the University of Saskatchewan Library, and he has a specialty in research data, open science, all kinds of things like that. So Kevin has agreed to come and join us today for one of my favorite sessions, which is research data management. And with that, Kevin, over to you.
Thanks, Merle. So, hi, everyone. Thank you for coming today, and thank you for expressing your interest in research data management. As Merle said, my name is Kevin Reed, and I'm an associate librarian here at the university. I've actually only been here for about 2 years, a little bit less than that, but I've been practicing research data management and thinking about the research process and how we do a better job of organizing our information and sharing that information for about 9 years. Before I started here, I worked at the NYU School of Medicine in New York City, where I was working to help researchers at every level, specifically in the health sciences, on how to better manage the research data. So over the course of the talk today, if you have any questions, please feel free to post them in the chat, or at the end of the presentation, we can also have verbal communication as well. Because we only have an hour, we'll try to keep everything to the chat for now. So the plan for today in terms of the learning objectives is I want to explain to you and help you articulate why data management is a really important part of the research process. I'm also going to be describing some of the new requirements that are coming out around research data management from Canadian tri-agency funding as well as publishers. So if you ever plan to publish a paper, what types of requirements you might expect to help you learn to apply methods to improve data management in your own research and to identify some institutional as well as some external tools that are going to actually help you manage, store, and share your data throughout the process. So I always like to start these presentations on a level of common ground with something relatively simple. And so here we have in front of you an example of a recipe for heavenly pie by someone named Mrs. R.D. Sycophus. And what you'll see on this particular set of instructions and in this recipe is we have a list of ingredients and we have a set of instructions. But you'll notice that when we look at this particular recipe, the instructions that are provided, which is put in shell, put cream, and chop nuts on top, when I see egg whites and sugar and chopped nuts, it's not necessarily clear to me how I'm actually supposed to make this pie. Am I putting raw egg whites into a shell? Am I just putting salt and sugar? Am I mixing anything together? The lack of description here causes me to really not be able to understand how to produce this heavenly pie or how this pie is created. So if we think about this on a comparison's sake, if the heavenly pie, the finished product, is a published article or a poster you're presenting or a report that you're writing, you can think of the recipe as the methods and the data that was created to produce that published article. And what we often see in research data management is this kind of lack of description around how the pie was actually created. So what we'll see is poorly described methods and unclear data. So we're not necessarily sure of the specifics of what the data is or the methods that were used to create the pie. And this is really what research data management is all about. How do we make sure that we understand that what we've done over every step of the research process is described and applicable to the final product of which we release in terms of published research? So just to take a little bit of a step back, I do want to get us on common ground as well as what I mean by data. And so often what I'll do is I'll break data up into two different components. We've got quantitative data on the left, which might be anything from numerical data around geographic coordinates, the vital signs of a patient, like their blood pressure or their heart rate, potential economic projections, environmental statistics, and some examples might be the purchase volume of something by online shoppers, the number of smokers per province, or the pH level in a soil sample. Whereas qualitative data is non-numeric in the sense that it's more descriptive in nature. It might be interviews, it might be the free text of survey questions, observations of an animal behaving, or of a patient behaving a certain way, oral histories provided, or general papers of written people's descriptions of their work. So examples might be observing a patient perform a task, interview recordings or videos, or written stories from community members are all examples of that kind of qualitative data. And this makes up a lot of what is produced over the course of a research project. We can also think of data as primary or secondary. So primary data is something that you personally have collected firsthand. It's original, it's never been collected before, and I've provided some examples there. Whereas secondary data might be collected by someone else, it might be collected by the federal government, it might be collected by a health agency, and that data has already been created, curated, analyzed in some way, which allows you to take that data and do work on it in the future. So we're really seeing two different types of data, the data you create yourself and the data you use by others to produce your own research or your own results. And so when we think about this, research data management really touches on every phase of the research process, from the part of where you're planning your research to when you're designing your study, to collecting your data, to analyzing it, and publishing your final results. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. So just to get a sense of what I mean by when I say what is data management, really data management is about all the steps you take to plan and document your research as you carry out your project. So comes from the stages of study design, to data collection, to data analysis. And ultimately, the question you want to be asking yourself when you're doing your research is my data understandable to others? So that someone else, if I gave it to them, could reuse it, could reproduce what I did, or could share it with others. So one of the things I like to talk about with research data management comes from this paper from Nature back in 2018. And it talks about how everyone needs a data management plan and that it's an essential product of research. But what I want you to focus on here, what I like best about this article is the subtitle, is that they sound dull because oftentimes people are more interested and obviously more interested in the research that they're doing themselves. But data management is such an important part of this that it often gets overlooked. And it's an essential product of research because it essentially dictates and describes everything that you've done. So when we break this down from research data management and the research process, this can look like many different things. For example, in the hypothesis and planning stage, you're asking your research questions, you're developing a hypothesis, and you might be drafting a protocol for your entire study. The study design and data collection, you might be documenting your experiments, collecting data, you're organizing that data in some way, you're putting that data somewhere by storing it, and then finally, once that collection process is finished, you're preparing your data to analyze it in some way. Once we get to the analysis phase, you might be analyzing your data, you might be documenting what you find, and if you're using a certain type of programming software, some of you may be familiar or comfortable with programs like R or Python, you would be saving the code that you created to analyze that data. And then finally, when it comes to the publication, you're generating all those beautiful figures that go into a paper or into a poster, you're finalizing your data, and you should be compiling all of your documentation. When we think about this, again, across the whole research process, these are all of the elements that you don't often see when you get to a publication stage. You're getting a nice summary of everything that was done, but data management wants you to focus on all of these other aspects of your research and to include those alongside with your research so that it's more understandable. Now, the problem is in most research experiences, including my own past, less now because I try to practice what I preach, this is what you get at the end of a project, whether it's in physical form or a digital form. It's a mess of documents that you've created, and then oftentimes, how many of you have gone back 6 months to a project you did before and don't remember what you did, or don't remember where a certain file was, or don't remember how you described it or how you analyzed something? This is such a common practice, and this is what research data management is trying to avoid. So when we think about where we fall on the spectrum of research data management, this is really what we focus on. This is a paper from a colleague of mine at Stanford who really broke down data management into 4 different sectors. And the least being people who do research data management on an ad hoc basis. So when they're planning a project, they have a way of doing things, but it's not standardized, it's not documented. They might not necessarily follow a consistent approach. Whereas if we go to the other side of the table where things are optimized for reuse, there are plans in place. There are easy ways that think about other users who may actually interact with that data and work with that data in a certain way. So we're seeing here a spectrum where most people, I would say, when they haven't thought about research data management, fall into these 2 categories. Maybe you do a one-time really good job with your research data management, but you don't have stages in place to do so. But the goal with research data management is we're trying to get people onto these last 2 columns where it's active, it's informative, and it's optimized so that I could give you all of my data from my research and you would be able to understand it and use all of the documentation that I created with it. So I'm going to open up a poll, or I'm going to attempt to open up a poll here, and I want to see, based on what you've said, where would you place your own research practices within the table? Merle, can people see the poll? I'm not sure if they can.
I'm not sure either.
Okay, let's see if
Anyone
I can.
wants to unmute and see if they can and
Let's
say,
see.
on my screen, there's kind of a grayed out thing.
Yeah, we
Mine
can see it.
says the poll has ended.
Oh dear. Okay. Well, then in this case, in the chat instead, just so we can make sure, where would you place yourself in these four categories personally? Are you ad hoc currently? Are you one time? Are you active and informative? Or is it optimized for reuse? And I'll enter my own just so I can go along with this.
And I'll pause the recording while we enter into the chat.
It was ad hoc myself. Okay. I'm seeing some one-timers, some ad hocs. That's great. Now you have a starting point from which to work from. So I appreciate that and you sharing on the chat, and I apologize that the polls aren't working. Okay, perfect. Thank you. So Merle, you can continue with the recording if you'd like, and I'll keep going.
You bet. Sure did.
Okay, great. So all of that is said, maybe from what I've already talked about, you have a good understanding of why data management is important, but we're seeing a massive shift in research as to encouraging researchers to want to make data management more of a part of the research process. And the first reason is because the Canadian government, who obviously funds the tri-agencies, have released a research data management policy. And anyone who wants to receive funding from the federal government now needs to actually supply a data management plan in their grant proposals that describe how their data is going to be collected, documented, formatted, protected, and preserved, how existing data sets will be used, and what new data will be created over the course of the project, whether and how the data will be shared, where the data will be deposited, and who is responsible for that data. Similarly, anyone who wants to submit for funding also needs to commit to depositing their data somewhere. That not only includes the data, but all code or metadata that would help describe what that data is, as well as any other research outputs that come from anything related to the tri-agency supported research process. We also know that publishers now expect you to share your data when you publish with them. So for example, the Public Library of Science, or PLOS, is a pretty prominent journal that has a number of journals spanning a number of different areas of research in the sciences. And they require that you show proof that you've shared your data before they'll even accept your publication. So you might have the greatest possible study you've ever done, but if you refuse to share your data, they will not let you publish in their journal. So we're seeing a massive shift here, both from the funder side, as well as from journals that are saying, hey, we want to see you do a better job managing your research data and sharing that data more broadly. The other issue with research data management is most data that is currently shared is unusable. So there's this great article about avoiding data dumpsters and how a lot of the data that's being shared right now are these random spreadsheets or tables in PDF format that nobody can interpret. And because of that, people can't actually use or do anything with this data, let alone understand it. We also know that data is really hard to access. So you may see now when you go into a new journal publication or an article that there are these little data availability notes within them. But in this case, you can read this description. It says all the data is available by the author on reasonable requests. Well, what does reasonable mean? We don't know. But then it also says all the data is available in the published article, which we know is not true because a published article often doesn't include the raw data you need to understand it, as well as all of the documentation on how that data was produced. We do know from more recent studies that the continued value of research data declines as soon as an article is published. So I want to draw your attention to this graph D on the bottom right-hand side. And you can see on the x-axis here that the age of the papers in years, they tested how easily available it was to access the data or use the data after an article was published. And you can see the dramatic decline as the article ages as soon as it's being published. So this is a huge problem because we have research that is available but potentially unusable going forward. We also know that there's a massive reproducibility problem. So what we're finding, especially in the news more recently and in certain research projects, is that they've done a number of tests on different types of research and found that the studies that led to major drug developments or treatments were actually not reproducible. They couldn't reproduce any of the experiments, and therefore they couldn't validate the results. So one of the biggest examples of that is a major psychology study that looked at prominent psychology studies over a number of years, and they found that over half of them, they couldn't reproduce any of the results. And the main reasons why this happens is because there was a lack of transparency in how the data was collected or analyzed, and there was really poor documentation. So just imagine this, that there are treatments happening and there are drug developments going on that were a result of studies that people can't actually validate in today's current climate. So this is why research data management is such an important issue. Also, beyond the fact that we have these large national and international factors sort of driving us towards research data management, the other part of this is for yourself in doing your own research. Think about the challenges of being able to locate the raw data you've developed, again, a year from now or 2 years from now after you finished a project. Or can you easily connect different data that you collect? So if you're working with imaging data or you're working with field notes and you have qualitative interviews, are you able to connect all the data that's been collected from different people or different subjects or objects over time? And similarly, I've seen this a lot if you work in a lab setting. I've had people who are working on the same species and they're the same animal, had totally different naming conventions for them. And so people couldn't even connect their data together because of that. So these are just simple issues that can be resolved by having a good data management plan and thinking about data management from the outset of your research project. So obviously, one of the reasons that you don't necessarily want to have bad data management is because you can lead to the worst case scenario. And there's this great website, if those of you who haven't heard of it, called Retraction Watch. And what it does is highlight all of the reasons why certain journals or certain articles are retracted. Now, many of them are examples of people doing faulty science or manipulating images. But oftentimes what you'll see is a simple retraction because somebody just had really bad data management practices. So in this case, a geneticist who was a graduate student had 4 papers retracted simply because they had poor data management. And when they interviewed the researcher afterwards, it happened because they didn't plan out how to develop the figures in the early preparation process. They weren't even able to find the raw data that was used to produce the figures, which is why their papers were retracted. And ultimately, all of this could have been solved if they had a better data management plan and better lab organization overall. So just food for thought for you as some of the worst case scenarios of what might happen if you don't follow good data management practices. So let's think about data management now in the context of the research process. What does good data management look like? So I'll pose this question to you in the chat. What do you think good data management might look like if you were to practice it today before I provide you with some guidance here? What comes to mind as what good data management might look like? Document. Yep. Keep a record of everything. Excellent. Yes, storage is another really important piece. Naming schemes, places, perfect. Oh, you guys are awesome. Yes, that is a wonderful, that last comment is very, very important. And you're going to see why that's important as I talk about it. Thank you all for sharing that. That's really helpful. And it's nice to know that you're thinking in the same realm as I am. So excellent. I hope this will be helpful for you. Okay, we can start the recording again.
Already did. Off
Perfect.
you go.
So what does good data management look like? Oftentimes, good data management is going to be an inventory of what your data is, a strategy for describing the data that collect, that's protocols or workflows that you have, a plan to preserve your data for the long term. And I don't mean preserve it for a year, I mean preserve it 10, 15 years down the road so you could still open it and use it at that time. And a method for ensuring that you can provide access and meaningful access to your data. So one of the common ways and frameworks that we use to think about data management now are the FAIR principles. And the FAIR principles rely on you thinking about how to make your data findable so that people would actually be able to locate and understand your data, to make it accessible. So not only can they find it, but they can actually gain access and use it. Interoperable, meaning that you can take your data and combine it with someone else's data. And because it's collected in a standardized way, it's easy for them to be integrated together. And then finally, reusable. There's actually information that helps someone understand how to reuse it. So the first thing that I always do, and I always recommend people do when they are starting a research project, so before they've even started collecting methods, but this comes around when you're starting to think about what your research process is going to look like, is to create a data inventory. So the inventory should describe what are the types of data that you're collecting? What is that data going to look like? What are the file types that you're generating from this data? And we'll talk a little bit about this later, but depending on how you collect your data and what file types you use, you may need to think about transferring those types to something else so that it can be usable for the long term. How stable is the data in the original form? So are you collecting that data once? Are you updating that data every day, every week, every month? This is a really important thing to think about because that data is going to change. How are you going to track how it changes over time? How much data will you be generating? This is going to dictate how much storage you need, where you're going to actually put your data, how you plan to disseminate it later on, and what other information would be necessary to understand your data. So your protocols, any templates you have, questionnaires you've built, code or software or tools that you use to collect data. All of this is fair game and helps increase the understandability of your data. So here's just an example. Types of data I'm collecting: sensor recordings, I have transcripts from interviews, and I have surveys. I've collected data in these 4 file types. Once my data is collected, I'm not modifying it in any way, so I don't have to worry about versioning. But I know that I'm going to have 500 megs per audio file, which is going to require me to have 25 gigs of audio space. And then in terms of the code, if I'm going to use a certain software program to analyze my data like SPSS, I want my scripts and files saved. I will probably share my interview questionnaire, the protocol of how I carried out my experiment or my interviews. And oftentimes people will also create a data use guide for you to use. So this actually is just a written guide that tells somebody, here's the data you need, here are the tools you need in order to understand and reuse my data. This comes down to the importance of documentation. So I know I've mentioned this a few times, but I can't stress this enough. Documentation is the key to understanding your data, not only for yourself, again, a couple of years down the road, but for others who want to gain access to your data. So the key considerations I want you to think about is, will my data make sense to somebody else? So every time you collect data, think to yourself, will this make sense to somebody? And will someone else be able to understand what I did and how I did it? So I know you described those in the methods section in the paper, but this goes a step further to provide people with that additional information. So the first thing to do is describe your methodology. Where is your data coming from? How are you collecting it? What are you measuring or testing or examining? And then what software programs or tools did you use to work with the data? If you collected a survey on SurveyMonkey, what version did you use? What time of year did you use it? If you analyzed your data in SAS or SPSS, what version of SAS did you use? Because if a version happens later and someone tries to use your data in the same way, it might not work. So that's something that's really important to consider as well. Really, really important. Build a data collection plan. So on the left-hand side, we have my own data collection plan for a study that I did last year. And on the right-hand side, we have a different type of data collection plan, which actually visualizes what somebody does. No matter how you approach a data collection plan, the important thing to describe is the step-by-step nature of the process. So this can accompany any of your data so someone can see what you've done. I really liked the visualizations that people have come up with recently because it helps somebody think about, in a visual manner, all the different stages that you've taken over the course of your research project. The other thing that's really important is once you're collecting your data, and let's say you're collecting it in a tabular form, like in a spreadsheet, is it actually going to make sense to somebody? So this is what I was talking about before when I was talking about data dumpsters. If I was to give you this particular example of a spreadsheet, you would have no idea what I was collecting. What does P1 mean? What does P2 mean? What does a 0 mean? What does inactive mean? And I will tell you, this is an actual example that a researcher from NYU allowed me to use for demonstration purposes. This was his actual data. And so what we had to do was work to understand when you're creating variable names, that they're actually descriptive of what's inside the data, as well as what does all of these different numbers mean. And one of the ways that you can do that is to actually provide some level of data description. So define data so that others understand what you're measuring. List your variables and provide a definition of what they mean. How are they represented? Is it a text? Is it a scale? Is it a number? Is it a multiple choice question? And then what are the units of measure? If I'm collecting weight, am I collecting it in pounds, in kilograms? If I'm in England, is it stone? These are the types of things that you should be thinking about if you're collecting any kind of tabular data. Luckily, we have what's known as a data dictionary. So basically, if you have any type of tabular data, you want to be developing some form of dictionary. So here on the screen, you can see the variable name, which describes briefly what the variable contains, a description of that variable, the type, so in this case, n means number, the number of numbers that are allowed, and then on the final column, we have all of the values associated with it. So we can see, in this case, I know that 1 means CBD, whereas 2 means outlying CBD. And so wherever your data goes, the data dictionary goes as well. So ultimately, it provides that great layer of documentation that allows people to understand what your data means and how it was collected. The next thing comes down to organizing your data. So file organization seems like a really simple thing, but if you don't plan it out ahead of time, you're doomed. This happens to me all the time. I'm like, okay, I'll create a folder, I'll throw all my stuff in there, it's gonna be great, and then I go back a week later and I'm crying because I can't find what I need. So in this case, you want to think about before you start, what are the files you're creating? Can you categorize them in different ways in terms of what makes the most sense for you in terms of grouping them together? And then finally, is there a workflow for you that you want to develop where people should add or change or move files? So we can think about file organization. Best practice is having one directory per project and then organizing it in a way that makes sense for you. So often what I'll do is I'll have a data folder, I'll have an administrative folder, which covers the minutes I have with my research team, any notes that I've taken. I'll have a protocol section, which will have all of my documentation within it. And then when it comes to a manuscript or a poster or a conference of some kind, I'll have a separate folder for that as well. This just allows me to make sure that I'm keeping things separate and organized and tidy all at the same time. So as I mentioned, just a little bit of a recap there, use one directory per project, separate out your components, have a file naming plan, really important, make your original data read-only, and create some README files. And I'm going to talk a little bit about those in the coming slides. So the value and the simplicity of a README file is a beautiful thing. Really what you want to do is for every folder or every file that might require explanation is to create a README file, which can be a simple TXT file that lives in your folder that describes what it is and what's in this folder and what do the files mean and what should they do. They should provide a short description of your data, how it was collected, information about software needed to use that data, who's actually responsible for that data, and how it should be used and analyzed. So here's an example of one that I've used in the past. I just have a README file next to a really important file in my folder, and it says this is the file name, which is library survey raw data, a brief description of it, the methods I used, and who's responsible for it. And notice that I've included other file names that are relevant, and I've included the specific software I used to collect it and analyzed it, and who did so. So it doesn't even have to be this comprehensive, but a README file just helps you when you go into a folder, you open it and say, oh, what's in here? And it gives you a better sense of what you need to do. The other thing, which seems so simple, is file naming. And it's something that is mundane, but I think when you think about what file name means, it's really important. So in this case, here we have a file name that looks like it might have a date at the end of it. And if dates are important for you, it's always great to date your research. But based on the chat, what do you think this date is? What date are we looking at in this file name? December 6th, okay. Other thoughts? What about June 12th, 2011? Yeah, January 26th. Exactly. So the point here with this is you want to remove as much ambiguity from your file names as possible, especially if the date you've collected something is important. Coming up with a standard way of doing things is a really simple and easy way to make your life a lot better and a lot easier. So one of the ways to do this is use unambiguous dates. There are specific file naming standards where year, month, day is a standard. And you can put that in a README file, say everything needs to be described in this folder this way. You also want to be descriptive. File.txt or final.txt is not helpful for you. But having dates and making it human readable is essential for people to be able to understand it. Also try to be consistent. So making sure that you're ordering things in the right way so it's easy for you to find. Also, if you're uploading this into a machine or into a program, that it's easy to read. Try not to use abbreviations or acronyms if they don't make sense. Nobody's going to understand them. And I've had times when I've gone back 5 years later and I've looked at something, I'm like, what did I mean by this? I have no idea. And you have to end up sifting through all of these different files that you don't need. So when thinking of file names, spaces are considered delimiters in programming, so try to use dashes, underscores, or as I've shown here, camel case, which means you capitalize every other word. So it's easier for you to see what it's about. These are some easy, simple ways to improve your data management practices. Also, avoid special characters. So keep it to letters, numbers, and underscores. I've had a situation where somehow an @ got fixed into my file name, and it created 350 copies of the same file in a Dropbox. So these are things that are, again, you want to avoid, but they're relatively easy, but they make a big difference in the long run, keeping your data organized. Version control, also very essential. Making sure that you're creating extensibility. So if you know you're going to be creating 100 files, you want the sorting to work well. So you add zeros in front of it to make sure that you can account for all of the different files that you might be creating over the course of your project. If you're interested or keen to upload some of your existing file names, there are some great bulk renaming tools that are out there. These are the 3 that I've included, which allow you to incorporate all your files and change them in one fell swoop. And I highly recommend if it's something that you're interested in doing. But going forward, think about developing a file naming convention for a research project so everything is created the same way, organized the same way. Okay, just out of curiosity in the chat, from a yes or no, do you currently have a file naming convention for your research projects? Okay. So I'm seeing some hard no's and some maybes and some most. So that's good. Again, learning is good. So this hopefully will open your eyes to potentially making your life easier. Because I think every time I start a research project, I don't even think there's going to be that many files. And then I realize how much content you actually build over the course of a research project. Having some level of organization has saved me so much, and it's such a mundane topic, but it really has made a huge difference for me. Okay, thank you. So once you've collected everything and you have this plan, it's now time to think about where you're going to store it. Where is it actually going to live? So there's lots of different data storage options at USask, and I wanted to show this slide because also, depending on the type of data that you're collecting, it's going to have an impact on where you can actually store it. So if you work with patients or with humans in any kind and it's restricted data, you have a limited availability as to where you can put your data and what you can do with that data versus if it's public and you can put it anywhere. So you want to have a plan about where your data is going to live at each stage of the process. And if you know you're going to have sensitive data of some kind, that you have that figured out ahead of time so that you don't necessarily make a mistake by putting really sensitive data in a place that you don't want to. So think about where your data is going to live at every stage of the project and document it. Maybe during the starting phase, it's on your laptop or a lab computer. And then when you're working on it, it's on your desktop. And then you move it to an external hard drive, or it goes to the O drive, or it gets shared to a repository, or put on a USB stick and shoved in your drawer. These are things that you want to think about from the outset so that you know where your data is living as you progress through your research. So again, when you plan for storage, remember your inventory. The inventory is going to help dictate where you're going to store your data. Document where it's going to live throughout the project. Think about what's going to happen when you need to move data from one place to the other. Who's responsible for that? If you work in a big team, and often many of you are going to move on to work in teams of many, many people. I've worked in collaborations of over 30 people before. And so data management and the movement of data is incredibly important to have described and articulated ahead of time. And again, think of who's responsible of that and assign someone. Because if you deem everyone responsible for data management or for moving data, that really means that nobody's responsible because no one is actually accountable for doing that work. So that's just something else to think about and to ask questions about if you're working in a lab for the first time to get those answers and make sure that everyone's on the same page. So out of curiosity, where do some of you currently store your data? Where are some of the places that you put your data currently? When you're working on a project, OneDrive, great. Okay, that's good. And we're going to talk about why using USask sponsored material is helpful. Password protected USB, great. Excellent, okay. Perfect. So depending on the type of storage option you use, that's also going to have an effect on how your data is preserved in the long run. So preserving your data is something I really want to talk about because the important thing to remember is just because you've stored your data somewhere doesn't actually mean it's being preserved in the long run. So preservation is really there to help protect you from hardware and software obsolescence, meaning that if you collect your data in a certain way now, you want to make sure that you can actually use that data again in the future, again, even a year or 2 years down the road. So on the left-hand side here, we have a former colleague of mine's PhD thesis, and it's available on a Jazz drive. Have any of you ever heard of a Jazz drive before? Right. Okay, exactly. So the problem with this is that the hardware to actually support the integration of Jazz drives doesn't exist anymore. So if she would actually want to upload and find her data, she would have to go to a used hardware store for computer hardware and try to find something that supports Jazz drives to get access to her data. So you want to think about if you're collecting data on a certain type of hardware that's specific to a certain lab, that you are going to be able to transfer it to a different program later. The same with software. If you're using proprietary software in a lab or you're using something specific or homegrown, a lot of researchers create their own software. The worst thing that could happen is that you go to open it a year from now and the program doesn't exist anymore, or it's not able to be opened on different types of programs, and you get something like this, which is an encrypted or encoded file. So when you're thinking about file formats, the best thing you can do with your data is try to transfer as much of your data into an open format as possible. So on the left-hand side, I have proprietary formats, which are common, like Excel and Word. We use them all the time, but we don't know if they're going to be around forever. And if any of you have used other types of software, Word doesn't play nice with a lot of other things. So if you can transfer your data into these other formats, they will be preserved and be able to be opened by any program forever, in perpetuity. So just think about, depending on the types of files you're generating, is there a way for you to transfer those elsewhere? Again, think about the continued value of your research. If you're using unusable formats, no one will ever be able to use those again going forward. Another really important thing to consider, if you have really valuable data, or you have your raw data set that you've collected, and that's in a table format, or that is a series of interviews, you always want to protect that master file. So what I encourage you to do is create a single master file that never gets touched. It is the final master version of your data, and then you make copies of it. And then you can put it into Excel, you can put it into SPSS, you can open it on some strange drive. But as long as you have that final version that's in an open format, it will always remain protected and safe. And then you can play with it in other programs later. I highly, highly recommend you do this because it ultimately prevents against data loss. And I've worked with too many researchers who haven't done this and have lost like years of their life for data. So just keep that in mind. Also, try to follow the 3-2-1 rule. Keep at least 3 copies of your data, store 2 backup copies on different devices or storage systems, and keep at least 1 backup copy offsite. So you can use a cloud system, and that's great, but having an external hard drive, having something on the computer on OneDrive is excellent because that's also backed up by the university. But why, for example, might you want to keep a backup copy offsite? Because what's the problem if I have an external hard drive, a USB drive, and my laptop all on my desk at once? What's the risk associated with that? Exactly. Fire destroys them all. Very dramatic, but not untrue. So when I first arrived at the NYU School of Medicine in my previous role, Hurricane Sandy had just happened, and researchers lost tens of years of their life because all of it got washed away and all their data was in a single lab, in a single place. So again, think about how often you're going to back up your data and make sure you have one at home and one at school or one in a different place at your parents' house or at your relative's house somewhere. So that's a great point, Melissa. And so in that case, what will happen when it comes to sensitive data, that gets run by the university. So when your data is stored in data store is backed up in an offsite location, it's backed up on campus, and it's backed up at a third location as well in the cloud. So it's getting that 3-2-1 rule built in, but the university is covering it for you. So when you have sensitive data, that's why it's so important that you use the university's tools because they're the ones who are responsible for making sure that that data is going to be around for the long term. I will link the information to data store after this talk as well. Okay, now comes the next phase. And if any of you are going to come to my talk next week around open science, we're going to dive into this a little bit more deeply. But I want to talk about providing access to your data. So when we think about the research process and research data management, when it comes time to publish your research, what research data management wants you to do is not just publish your paper, but your data and all the documentation we've worked to build over the course of this talk as well. You want to think about where you can store your data or share it. And so there are things called repositories, which are basically public websites that allow you to make your data discoverable and searchable for others. There are institutional repositories like USask's Harvest system. There are cross-disciplinary repositories that focus on lots of different areas of research in one place. And then there are discipline-specific ones, like ones completely devoted to rat research or to cancer research. And what's important is if you are going to choose to deposit your data in these places, some of them offer preservation, some of them provide access, and all of them provide storage, but you need to decide beforehand what you want this to do and what the purpose of it is for. If you're interested in looking at public repositories for data in an area of interest, read3data.org is a registry of all the different public data repositories that exist in the world, and it tracks all of them and incorporates them into a searchable interface. So I highly encourage you to explore that area. In Canada, we've also developed the Federated Research Data Repository. So in this particular location, what's happening is we're trying to organize and collect all Canadian research data in this place. And you can notice next to the search bar, there's this deposit data section, which would allow you to deposit your own data onto this platform so it could be found alongside all of the other Canadian data. Just to give you an example, one of the reasons you also want to share data, again, is to comply with publications. And so here is an article that I published in the Public Library of Science, which required me to share my data. And so what I did was I shared it in a tool called Figshare because it was relatively easy to use. And it's connected directly to my publication. And you can see it even gives me a citation. So when you share your data, you're also going to get credit for it. So if someone was to use your data for future research, they would have to cite you in order to do so. Again, when you're sharing, think about the access versus meaningful access. So sharing that spreadsheet with P1, P2, or P3 as my headers is not going to be helpful. And that's why all of the visualizations of my data collection plan, the description of my inventory of my data are all there and available for me, is really what matters and what's important. So again, think about and ask yourself the question, how would you describe your data to others if you shared it? So put all of the information you've compiled together, which I've listed on this page. And then when it comes to publishing your research, you have your publication, you have all your data management material incorporated, and your data sharing options of where you decide to share at the end. Also, I just wanted to mention, because people were talking about sensitive data, really important to ask yourself is, does this data reveal anything about who it was collected from? And can you ethically, legally share this data? Always check before sharing. Are you permitted to share publicly? If there's restrictions placed on it, how would someone actually go about getting access to it? So some examples are, there are often applications that are created for people to request data. Sometimes communities or participants need to approve the actual sharing of data before it can happen. But you want to think about this at the outset is, if my data is restricted, how do I let people know that they can still get access to it, but they're going to have to follow some parameters to do so. So protect your participants' information. Think about anonymization and de-identification of your data. So anonymization means that you can never go back and find identifying information again, whereas de-identification means that you take a data set and you pull personal information out of it, but there's still a copy where I could go back and find that information later on. There's a great list of tools in that link below, and I'll be sharing the slides afterwards as well. Also very, very important, especially nowadays, it's working within this province. If you're working with particular communities, in particular Indigenous communities, there are some new principles that are being developed to help you understand what it means to work with certain communities and the types of rights that they have when working with them. So the CARE principles for Indigenous data governance and the OCAP principles help you get a better sense of what it means to collaborate with Indigenous researchers and with Indigenous participants in the study to make sure that you are respecting their rights and access to data as well. So depending on whether or not you're able to share your restricted data or not, or you have public data, would you consider sharing your research data publicly? Yes or no? Just out of curiosity, based on the ethos of what we talked about today. Okay. Perfect. Wonderful. So what I wanted to show you was an example of a gold standard of data management and data sharing. And this comes from a particular neuroscience institute. And what they've done here, this is the Collaborative Research in Computational Neuroscience. What they've done is provided incredible level of description on every stage of their research process and how to understand the data. So through the web page, what you can do is you get a summary of all of the information that they have. You have a summary of the data, the format that the data is in, how to gain access to it, and how to give credit to the researchers if you use their data. From there, we get a complete data inventory of everything that's included within the data set and all of the documentation associated with it. We get a process workflow, so we know all of the methods in a visual way, how an experiment is run, what data is produced from it, all in a very clear delineated description. And we get a very clear idea of how you download and access this data. So you can see all of these stages encompassed into one particular project makes it so much easier to understand and access that and use that data. So just to wrap up, because I know we're getting a little bit short on time, but I want to give time for us to have questions, is some tools to help you get started. Probably one of the most essential tools that you can use to get started, and I highly encourage you to do so, is the DMP Assistant. Anyone can create an account and link it to the USask affiliation. And what it does is it helps you make a data management plan from start to finish. So after you complete your data inventory, what it allows you to do is it asks you questions about your data collection process, the documentation you're going to build, how you're going to store it, what your plans for preservation are. And it allows you to fill in this information and export it for your own research. Also really important is that this particular project is now developed templates. So you should look at these templates to see if your own research area or your research interests are there, because it asks specific questions associated with your research questions and your research endeavors. So the templates are there to help you and to guide you in answering questions that will help you think about how to plan your data management from start to finish. There are also a number of exemplars that you can take a look at that will show you what a good data management plan will look like. So whether you're working in humanities or natural sciences or social sciences, this link will allow you to see a completed data management plan and see the benefits of how people have written them up. Everyone is different and these are unique, so take them with a grain of salt, but ultimately they should help you think about what are the types of information you should include here, as well as this presentation today. There's also different resources that are available on the Portage website around learning how to storage and preserve and assign responsibilities to your data. And we have our own guide at USask that can help you through the process as well. So just to summarize here before we open it up for questions. Some things to think about and some key takeaways. Getting started with data management, take a step-by-step approach. Complete your data inventory first. Write a data management plan second. Develop your file structure based on what you know from the first two stages, and implement a strategy for how you're going to document and describe everything you do at each stage of the process. So every time you make new data, or every time you create a new experimental protocol, how are you going to make sure it's understandable to others? Always, always, always important to think about data management should be addressed before you start a study. The worst is getting 6 months in and realize you're in a total drowning mess of data and documents and you don't know what to do with them. And I know I've talked about a lot of things today, but if you take away even one thing from this, any documentation that you provide is better than none. And a lot of researchers these days are very poorly providing data management. And I think you as undergraduates thinking about research really have an opportunity to set the gold standard for what data management looks like in the future. So again, think about what would someone need to know, plan and document it as you can, save your data in formats that will allow you to create for future use. Use the tools I've shown you because they're going to help you organize and manage your data. And again, be sensitive to who you're collecting data from and think ethically about the people you're working with and collecting data from and what their rights are in the process. There's a lot of references here about how to make a dictionary and data management policies available to you that I encourage you to look through if you'd like to. And I'm happy to take questions. And again, if you have questions after this and you need help with data management, I'm here for you. Please use my email, and I'm happy to talk to you about this in the future. So thank you. And I'll
Awesome. Kevin, I'm going to stop the recording so that the questions are absolutely open, although one came through already. Do some data repositories require payment to use? I'm going to stop the recording and you can go ahead and answer.
Okay. So thanks, Adam.